Well, Happy New Year, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're based. I think it's fair to say that one point of continuity in 2025 from 2024 is that Brazil will be a centre of attention for the global online gambling industry, not least following the launch of the regulated market in Brazil on January 1st. I'm James Kilsby, Chief Analyst for Vixio, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this third in a series of webinars that Vixio has hosted on the Brazilian market, joined by two real Brazilian market experts who I'll introduce just in a moment. As a point of housekeeping, if you do have a question, you can submit that in the chat box that will be on your screen. We may not have time to get to audience questions today, as there's a lot to talk about, to say the least, but we will endeavour at Vixio and on behalf of our guests to get back to you with your inquiry if you want to submit it. We move on, just give a quick intro to Vixio for those of you that are not clients of ours and not familiar with Vixio. Vixio is a RegTech company and the leading provider of regulatory intelligence, market data and forecasts, and a variety of research and compliance tools that help operators and suppliers expand into new markets and ensure that they remain compliant in those markets that they're already in. Again, if you're not familiar with Vixio, please do visit our website at vixio.com, where you'll find various information about our company, but also some resources, including on the Brazilian market, that will provide extra context to the things we're going to talk about today. Moving on, Brazil, it is very easy to understand why the attention of the global gambling industry has been so centrally focused on Brazil over the course of the past 18 months or so. We at Vixio have recently updated our market forecast for Brazil, and we anticipate that the regulated online gambling market that launched in Brazil on January 1st will become a enter the top 10 of the largest regulated markets for online gambling globally this year in its first year, and then will rise to more than $6 billion in GGR by 2028. And that would then see Brazil, as you can see on your screen, jostling with Italy for a number 2 spot as the second largest regulated market for online gambling in the world. So what we're talking about here is a transformative regulated market opportunity for the online gambling industry. You can see there on the right-hand side of your screen, the Brazilian market has evolved relatively quickly after a period of slow going when it's come to regulation. And I think it's fair we can break down the development of the regulated market in Brazil into 4 distinct phases. Firstly, a legislative phase that led to the approval of a law to regulate fixed odds betting and establish a national licensing system in December of 2023. Expert speakers and I hosted our first webinar on Brazil around about that time. We hosted a second one right in the thick of the rulemaking phase, which ran from this early 2024 roughly to the middle of the year, where we saw the Secretary of Prizes and Bets, the SPA, within the Ministry of Finance, release a series of regulatory ordinances and open a licensing process for operators of online gaming and sports betting. We're really today going to be talking about phases 3 and 4. Firstly, the licensing and launch phase, which culminated in the approval of licenses to various operators on December 31st. And then secondly, what comes next? Now that we have a licensed and legal market in Brazil, that's not the end of the story, and there are plenty of pending policy uncertainties that I will digest today alongside our expert panelists, who I will introduce right now. We'll be joined by Rafael Marchetti Marcondes. Rafael is the Chief Legal Officer for Rei do Pitaco. If you're not familiar with Rei do Pitaco, it is the leading daily fantasy sports operator in Brazil, and recently obtained a license to expand beyond fantasy sports into sports betting and online gaming. It's fair to say Rafael has been centrally involved on behalf of the industry in the development of this legislative and regulatory framework that I've mentioned. I think a few better experts who really have been plugged into the process since day one to share with us today. Alongside Rafael, joined by Luis Felipe Maia, the founding partner of Maia Yoshiyasu Advogados in Sao Paulo. Luis, as fair to say, being a gaming law expert in Brazil, I think predating almost the existence of the gaming law structure that we're speaking today. A number of years, Luis has provided advice around all matters of gambling law in Brazil, and again has advised many clients as they've moved into this market that has just gone live. Rafael, Luis, Happy New Year to you both, and thank you again for taking the time to join Vixia today on this webinar.
Happy New Year for you too, James. It's always a pleasure to be with you and Luis. Great expectations for these years. For this year, yeah.
Yeah. Happy New Year, Che. Thank you for the invitation. It's always good to be here during these webinars. This year has, I don't know if the year has already started or if we're still in 2024 because we have been working non-stop. But the good thing is that finally we have a regulated market and regulated companies in Brazil. So it's the culmination of a lot of work from several people. So we have a lot to celebrate.
No, I think that's right. It should spare a thought for legal advisors, regulatory officials, and executives with operators, suppliers, etc., who didn't have much of a Christmas holiday this year as a result of this, the culmination of the licensing regime coming into effect. So I'm sure on behalf of many in the industry that has been much appreciated. I'm just going to dive right in if we can. As we've said several times, the market is now live as of January the 1st, but we did see a late twist in the process in that I believe it was 66, now gone to, I think, 68, but of those 60 plus operators that have been licensed in Brazil, all but a dozen or so of them have received provisional licenses. Luis, can you explain how did that come around and what the difference is between these provisional licenses that have been approved and the permanent ones, and then what are the next phases in the process in terms of what provisional licensees have to do over the next 30 to 60 days in order to stay in the market as permanently authorized operators?
Sure. I think this solution that was created by the regulator, establishing provisional licenses and definitive licenses, depending on the status of the application, was very wise. The issue is there was a lot of work involved. The regulator worked nonstop. I received calls from the regulator staff on during Christmas on December 24. They were working around the clock. They have been working on the weekends, but there was still some information that they needed clarification on some applications, and there was also the technical difficulty from some of the accredited labs to deliver all the technical certificates for games, integration, platforms, sportsbook. And this was a very good solution to allow the operators who were very close to complying with all the regulatory requirements and could not comply with them either because of the extra workload from the gaming labs or because they might have already complied, but the regulator was still finishing the analysis of the documents to have the launch of the regulated market on January 1st. At the end of the day, I think the key differences between the two licenses, the provisional one and the definitive one, is that those companies with provisional licenses have just received on Friday a set of questions from the regulator regarding some topics. Some of them just received a message saying that everything is okay. Some of them are pending some certificates. Some of them are pending clarifications regarding, it may be the origin of the funds. It may be one foreign document that is pending sworn translation. But in operational terms, there is no difference. So whatever, all the companies are authorized to operate from January 1st. They are subject to the same taxation. They can provide the regulator with the pending certificates within 30 days, with a justified extension for additional 30 days if the laboratory requests. So there's not much difference.
No, Rafael, Hido Pitaco was one of, I think it was 14 operators that received a full license on December 31st. Congratulations, parabéns. What were the biggest compliance challenges that you and Hido Pitaco experienced during the process and you had to overcome in order to make it to the starting line on January 1st? And then what advice would you share with other operators or even suppliers that are still in the process?
James, being one of the 14 operators to secure the full license was a huge milestone for Hido Pitaco. So thanks for that. What made it particularly challenging for us was that when I joined the company, we were like solely focused on fantasy sport, and we had like zero structure to transition into the regulated betting market. So we had to build like everything from the scratch: anti-money laundering, anti-money laundering policies, what more, compliance frameworks, data protection protocols, responsible gaming initiatives, and even like our communication and advertisement strategies had to be rethought. So it was quite challenging in that sense. But of course, this was our reality, and every operator's journey is different. But one of the biggest challenges I noticed across the board was gathering all the documentation required to prove the origin of funds and meeting the certification requirements. As like Luis just mentioned, the accredited labs were like completely swamped, struggling to handle the sheer volume of requests. That's where we had like a bit of an edge, I would say. We were the first company to sign a contract with GLI to certify our platform and games. So that head start allowed us to submit our certification well ahead of schedule. So this was some good initiative that we have and helped us in the end. And for operators that are still going through this process, my biggest piece of advice is to be proactive, I would say. Make yourselves available to the Minister of Finance, and don't just stick to the bare minimum of what's required by law. Share any information that could help the regulator make a well-informed decision. It might feel like an extra work, but it really makes a difference. That's what I can share with you as something that worked for us.
Right. So we can see the four phases. Lucy sort of defined the Brazilian rollout process, and I think what's been curious to observe is during that third phase, really, which was building towards the licensing and launch of the market, we saw a change in the environment in Brazil in terms of how the online betting industry was being perceived by the media, and that sort of extended to politicians and beyond. It's been many twists and turns just within this area, but a lot of negative media headlines in major news publications around the amount being spent by Brazilians in the then unregulated market. That led to some changes in the transition process where the Brazilian regulator brought the drawbridge up for those companies that had not yet applied for a license at that mid-September. And so it seemed as though with this impending launch, with everything all set in terms of regulations and a licensing process on running, it did seem that there was at least some degree of cold feet on the part of politicians and other stakeholders around what was going to happen with the regulated market here. One of the tangible outputs of that seeming change in the environment was the Senate establishing a CPI, a Special Investigation Committee on Online Betting, to seemingly probe the regulatory environment for online gambling, even before we've reached this point of moving to a regulated market. That's CPI is still ongoing, as I understand it. But Luis, could you, I guess, speak to that? Explain what the Senate Commission is, and then sort of a little bit more generally, is there a risk through the Senate CPI or other avenues that we could see the rules of the game change, new regulations or stricter regulations imposed in Brazil quite quickly? I mean, advertising is one area that we've seen in Europe where regulatory change can come fast. So
this is not the first congressional investigation on the betting industry. The Chamber of Deputies already had one. There's another one regarding sports integrity at the Senate, match fixing, and this is actually the third. You see, that the first thing that we have to highlight is that the scope of this commission is extremely broad. It involves the influence of online gaming in the budget of families, possible money laundering schemes, advertising with social influencers. It's a mix of everything. And it started with a lot of traction, and then it lost a bit of that traction. There were some arguments between some key senators and some rumors of foul play. It's hard to say how it will return. The Congress is now in recess. They return to work on February 2nd. Some people expect this to cool down, but I think there is an actual risk of this commission proposing some changes in the law and in the regulation, and I think those changes could be applicable mostly to advertising.
And how it worked, if I'm not mistaken, the Senate Commission would make those recommendations, but the recommendations would then need to be the will of the full Senate and then the lower house, the Chamber of Deputies, to actually pick them up and implement them. So I guess the twofold is it fair to say what will this commission recommend, and then will those recommendations have?
They need to prepare a final report that may be approved or not by the commission, and part of that report can be some suggestions to the regulator, or some suggestions to the Senate, or even the production of a bill of law regarding the subject. So we don't know yet what will be created. What we expect, and this is my personal view, I don't know if that's a different view, but my personal view is that now with the regulated companies operating in Brazil, paying taxes, with the block of the offshore websites by the National Telecommunications Agency, with more restrictions on payments, I think that the appeal of this commission tends to be lower.
Yeah.
Rafael, you would agree with that? How are you and others in the industry thinking about the commission more broadly?
I definitely agree with Luis. I think that with the regulated market starting from January on, and having clear rules and companies paying tax, I think that the environment tends to be more controlled, and I believe that the Senate will make less noise than was doing before. But of course, as Luis mentioned, we have to be aware, because some potential restrictions, especially to advertisement, may raise from in the end of the CPI originally they were supposed to propose something, and if they have to propose something, I would expect having some restrictions in the advertisement area.
Yeah, and James, one of the subjects that we agreed to talk about actually has a very close relation to this, which is potential taxation.
Mm-hmm.
You see, an ordinance was recently published creating a work group between the gaming regulator and the tax authorities to try, and one of the issues that they are discussing is the collection of back taxes. And one of the issues that was always raised during the sessions in this congressional hearing and this congressional investigation was that the companies have never paid taxes in Brazil. And they always ask, okay, how much tax have you paid in Brazil? And that it was not fair that these companies operated in Brazil for so long, and that they should pay taxes for the past. I was strongly against the ordinance that allowed the migration of data and funds. And the reason why I was so strongly against it was because it creates evidence of an ongoing operation. Okay, basically, you're transferring the clientele, the funds, the brand. So and this in Brazil, one of the legal consequences is succession on all liabilities, including tax liabilities. The company that operated from offshore, regardless of the country where it operated, was not subject to taxation in Brazil. I mean, corporate taxation.
Yep.
But the clients in Brazil, they have always been subject to income tax on the prizes.
On winnings, yeah.
Okay, so all the winnings, they were subject to income taxation. And there is even a couple of consultations at COSIT, which COSIT is one of the, it's a department under the tax authorities that answers to consultations on how the winnings should be brought to taxation by the players. So I think we may see some attempt from the government to collect back taxes from the players. My concern here is that from what we heard in the Senate, that they may try to shift that liability to the operators.
To the operators.
There is no legal basis for that. That would be clearly unconstitutional, but it wouldn't be the first time we see unconstitutional tax obligations or tax laws being created. Of course, it would be subject to the courts to decide that it's not constitutional. But if they decide to go after the players, they may request from their operators, for instance, the list of all prizes paid in the last 5 years.
5 years, yeah.
And that could generate a lot of noise and a lot of problem for the industry.
Just to, I guess, for the benefit of the audience today, filling in the blanks there, you mentioned the ordinance that allowed for transfer of funds. I can't remember if it was late November or early December. The SPA issued an ordinance that specifically allowed for unregulated offshore operators to migrate existing account information and player balances to the regulated platforms. Simultaneously, we saw the Senate CPI take testimony from at least the CEO of one major offshore brand, and ask around payment of taxes. And I guess to sum up there's a degree of concern in the industry, and maybe Rafael, you can expand on this. There's a great concern in the industry as to whether has the door been opened for back taxes to be levied against the players of former offshore-facing brands? Is that something? Would you agree with Luis that this is a live issue for 2025? This risk of past taxation?
James, my understanding of this is that it's much aligned what Luis just mentioned, in the sense that, but I would like, he was like polite in saying that we may face some problems with tax authorities. I would say that's quite likely that operators may have some problem with infraction notes being charged from them. And I do believe this based on my previous experience before joining the betting industry. I worked for over 20 years in the tax area here in Brazil, and the Brazilian Federal Revenue Office is quite aggressive. So even when they don't have like solid grounds, they try to increase the amount of money that they intend to bring to the government. So we may expect some more aggressive approach to the operators that operated like offshore and didn't pay taxes here in Brazil. I'm not discussing here if there is enough grounds for that or not, but this is something very clear that we may expect. And even like we here as Rei do Pitaco, we decide not going offshore and just working here in the daily fantasy industry without expanding our activity to the betting market, because we have like a very conservative board made by VC funds, but conservative in that sense that they were much favorable for us not taking this risk. And I believe that we may, for the lawyers, it will be a great opportunity. For the industry, maybe some difficult moment, because everybody will be like in a new regulated market with like several challenges, and this could be another one that may come to the operators.
But sticking with tax, which I think several layers to why that can be a big theme of 2025. Brazil is in the process of implementing a big tax reform project. I guess as a starting point, Luis, there are several layers of taxation for the market that's launched on January 1st. The headline one being a 12% tax on GGR. There's a gaming-specific tax. Could you briefly explain the full picture of the tax burden on the market today, but then also how that is going to evolve in the next few years as a result of the tax reform initiative?
Let me try to do that in a way that nobody will sleep
yeah.
or kill themselves listening how the Brazilian tax system works. But basically, in a nutshell, the 12% they are not taxes. Okay, it's not a gaming tax. We have to recall that the fixed odds betting lottery is a lottery modality. And as such, any lottery has social destinations. Meaning, what actually happens is that 12% of the GGR does not belong to the operator at all. 12% of GGR belongs to those social destinations. The actual revenue, the gross revenue that belongs to the operator is 88% of GGR. Yep. And this is very important because there are some taxes in Brazil that levy on revenue, on gross revenue. We're talking about PIS and COFINS, two social contributions on the federal level, and they total 9.25%. They allow credits, so they resemble a VAT system, but only in theory, because you're allowed to have credits only from the acquisition of inputs. And then you have a lot of discussion on what can be considered as an input or not, depending on each activity. One of the main discussions that the industry will have in Brazil is whether marketing can be deemed as an input for online games or not. Then you have tax on service on the municipal level. So it depends on the city where the company is based. It can vary from 2% to 5% on revenues. So again, 88% of the GDR. Yep. And it does not allow credits. You have to pay that flat. And then on net profits, so all your revenues minus your deductible expenses. Not all expenses are deductible. But then you get to your net profit, or as the name that we use in Brazil tax-wise is real profit. You have to pay roughly 34%. And then there is no taxation on dividends.
So the different, but that's changing, right? As a result of over the course of the next few years, PS COFINS are being phased out and new taxes being brought in. And then in addition to that, if I'm not mistaken, the Congress has also approved a selective tax for harmful products, including betting. So I guess fundamentally, does particularly the selective tax, is that something you can explain what it is or what it will be? And is it fair to say that the industry is going to move to a higher tax burden as a result of the tax reform?
Yeah, what will happen if the tax reform is actually implemented? Instead of having PIS, COFINS, and tax on service, we will have CBS and IBS, which is a tax on goods and services and a contribution on goods and service that will total something around 26.5%. So you already have a higher rate
than 9.25, right? Yeah.
But they allow credits. It should be a perfect VAT system, in theory, again. But you also have the selective tax, which is basically the idea is to add a layer of taxation on goods and service that have negative impact on society in general. And gambling has been included in those discussions. However, the rate is not yet defined. So we don't know exactly what will be the impact of the selective tax on the gaming.
Rafael, how important is this new selective tax being called in the Brazilian press a sin tax? How important is it for the industry that the rate of this new tax is set lower rather than higher? Is this something that the industry is going to be focused on in 2025 and beyond?
Yeah, sure. I think that this like when we talk about tax is always something that concerns the operators and everybody that do business in Brazil, because we tend to have here very high taxes, and a prohibitive tax can be complicated to develop the business healthily locally. But what we have seen throughout like 2024 was discussions in the Congress about the selective tax, where all about was which activities should or should not be taxed. And in the end, as Luis just mentioned, fixed odd bettings were included in the selective tax. What we can expect for 2025? Now the focus will shift to defining the tax base and the rate to this selective tax. The problem is there is no cap or how high this tax can go, which means, at least in theory, that it could be set at a level that's essentially prohibitive. And this is what concerns the most the industry. When it should be, like, in my opinion at least, also a concern for the federal government, because international experience shows that when taxes are too high, it pushes people into the black market. So in the end, that hurts not only the industry, but also the government revenue, and even devalues the official licenses. We've seen these happen in places like France and Portugal, and
Germany,
yeah,
Mm.
it's something that we as an industry are watching closely.
Is the rate for the selective tax, is that likely to be debated and defined in 2025, or something that could even
Yes, it is expected to be debated. But we have had to the moment a few movements. Initially was like voting an amendment in the constitutional, after was a complementary law, and now we expect to have like the tax bases and also the rates settled in ordinary law. So this is what is coming for 2025.
Right. We've covered quite some big ground when it comes to regulatory risk on tax and on the CPI, but then I wanted to go to the Supreme Court. There are 3 pending challenges against Law 14790 and the federal legislation that's underpinning this new regime that were filed all filed in 2024 by 3 different plaintiffs, including the Attorney General, the Prosecutor General of the Republic. There was a 2-day public hearing on the betting industry, and I guess the outcome of that hearing is we saw the rapporteur, the presiding judge in those cases, at least declined to put an immediate injunction on implementing the law that would have stopped getting to the point of January 1st and launching the market. But if I'm not mistaken, those 3 challenges that were filed against the constitutionality of the federal law on fixed odds betting, those are still to be heard by the plenary of the STF and sort of weighed and ruled upon on their merits. Luis, if I could ask you first, on the basis that we didn't have an injunction, is there still a risk, nonetheless, that these STF cases, the Supreme Court cases, could still change the game from the industry? And I guess what I'm wondering there is, should the industry be aware that can the court not just rule sort of up and down, yes or no, the law is constitutional or not constitutional? Could we see the Supreme Court demand regulatory changes in order to make the law conform with the Brazilian constitution? We've already seen that through an injunction to prohibit the use of welfare funds for betting, as an example.
Yeah, I'll make a joke here. There is a common saying in Brazil that you never know what comes out from a judge's decision and a baby. So that being said, which basically means that we never know exactly what you expect, I think it's unlikely that the Supreme Court will rule against the regulation of betting in Brazil. I think both decisions that we had so far, either from Justice Luis Fux or from Justice André Mendonça, recognize the existence and the legality of the legal framework. And the most recent decision, it also recognized the legality of the restrictions on the state and municipal lotteries by the law that is being challenged. So I believe it's unlikely that we'll see any unfavorable decision coming from Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, I think the recent decision that decided that the states the state lotteries must be restricted to the territory of that state. That was a very good decision and a very good signal for the local industry.
You is it possible though that can the court issue a ruling that still demands or imposes additional changes, even if it doesn't find it unconstitutional, or do you think more likely that the court just upholds the regime as it stands?
Theoretically, they cannot legislate. So they should decide whether it's valid or not. I honestly don't think we're going, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to see any restrictions other than those that were already published, meaning people receiving assistance from the government cannot use that money to play, and restrictions on advertising that were also already in the regulation. So they were not creating regulation. They were just saying that you need to uphold it.
Yep. You've alluded to the next key area I wanted to ask around, which is the coexistence of the federal licensing framework with state regimes for fixed odds betting. As you alluded to, Luis, one of the sort of the epicenter of this debate has been Rio de Janeiro and the licensing regime in Rio, whereby Lotege, the Rio State Lottery, has allowed for state licensed operators to accept bets from not just within the state of Rio de Janeiro, but beyond. Justice Mendonça of the Supreme Court has now issued an injunction to order Rio to become a geofenced intrastate market. You said, Luis, you thought that was a important development for the industry, but Rafael, is that something you would agree with? What's how important is the situation with regards to Rio de Janeiro, and would you also welcome the order from the Supreme Court that we saw on January the 2nd? I think it was.
Mm-hmm. Honestly, James, I think that these kind of discussions are help in a sort of way, like speeding up the maturity of the Brazilian market, and that's a really good thing. But regardless of how the courts ultimately rule, the process is bringing much needed clarity to both foreign investors and local entrepreneurs to better define their business plans and strategies. But in this specific case, I may agree with Luis. I personally think that the injunction granted by Justice André Mendonça, limiting the license to operate only within the state of Rio de Janeiro, makes total sense, and especially from a practical standpoint. Allowing a company with a state license to operate nationwide just doesn't make sense. It would discourage interest in obtaining a federal license, and it kind of goes against the logic of our federal system. That's my point of view. And for me, it's like, imagine a company license in Malta being allowed to operate freely in the UK or Spain. It just wouldn't make sense,
That's a whole other story. I think that some of the listeners on this webinar will be painfully familiar with. But on the state, I guess what the question with regards to Rio de Janeiro is, in part, can a state licensed company operate beyond the borders of that state? It doesn't seem to be in dispute in any way that states do have the authority to issue their own local licenses for their territories, not just in Rio de Janeiro, but in Paraná and Maranhão and Paraíba. At least 3 states are embarking upon local licensing for fixed odds betting. Luis, how do you see the coexistence of state licensing frameworks and the federal market moving forward? And do you think there'll be more opportunities? And Sao Paulo, I guess, is the big big one there, right? You're talking a state of 40 million plus people. That
I have always said that I think the legal arguments to justify that the state lottery can be offered nationwide, they existed until Law 14790 from 2023 was published. And those arguments were exactly the same argument that allowed the offshore companies from Malta, Curacao, Anjouan, whatever, to offer sports betting and casino games to Brazilian players. Because according to the Brazilian civil law, any contract executed between absent parties is deemed as executed where the offer is made. So when you talk about online betting, and betting being deemed as a contract under Brazilian civil law, it is deemed as executed where the offer is made. If the offer is being made in Malta, that betting agreement is executed in Malta, and therefore it didn't trigger the misdemeanor law, because the gambling prohibition in Brazil is based on the misdemeanor law, and the misdemeanor law has a very specific territorial application. It applies only to misdemeanors that take place inside the Brazilian territory.
Yep.
Unlike criminal matters, where if it is a crime, if the effects of the crime take place in Brazil, the Brazilian law applies. If it is a misdemeanor, it's not the effects, it's the actual behavior. Yep. And the behavior here is the betting contract. In case of the states lotteries, it was exactly the same. So the company is based in Rio, the server may be in Rio or not, but the company is operating in Rio, and the offer is made in Rio. So if the player was in Paraíba or in São Paulo or anywhere else in Brazil, that was not an issue, because the offer was made in Rio, and that for all purposes, that lottery was sold in Rio. And that was applicable because in the same misdemeanor law, we have Article 53, which basically, it is a misdemeanor to introduce for the purpose of sale a state lottery ticket in another territory where it's not supposed to be sold. It was exactly the same thing.
Yep.
The issue is that the law 14790 from 2023 introduced a specific provision stating that the state lotteries cannot be offered in other states. And the discussion from Rio de Janeiro, what they argue is that, okay, we acknowledge that ruling, but our licenses were granted before that.
Yeah.
Actually, not the licenses, or actually not all the license, but the tender, the invitation for the license, the rules were published before that, which is not entirely true, because they made several amendments to that afterwards. I think the provision that was introduced by the law from 2023 was very important to create this, the legal grounds for restriction. And as I've been saying for the past 2 years, I think the legal arguments to defend otherwise are quite weak.
And do you think will states continue to move forward with adopting their own licensing regimes strictly for their own states? Is that something that we can still see moving on? You know, we've seen it in Paraná and other states. Will we see more?
There is more. There is a municipality in the state of Rio Grande do Norte called Bodó. Bodó has 2,363 inhabitants. And it recently issued an invitation for the license, for a betting license that would allow the operators to operate all over the country. And that license costs less than $5,000.
So that there's more at stake than just Rio de Janeiro, I guess. It's
much more. Again, I think this became a no-brainer, because either you apply the restrictions, or you're going to have small municipalities issuing licenses without any compliance, without any reasonability that will allow the companies to operate nationwide.
Interesting. We are getting short on time, and I wanted to cover two quick questions. I'm going to ask one question, I think, to you, Rafael, and then one to you, Luis. Obviously, in any regulated market, critical issue is enforcement, and particularly against unlicensed operators who are not part of the licensing regime. Brazil has begun blocking unlicensed websites, or websites that didn't apply for a license prior to September, via Anatel, the communications authority. I was going to ask you, Rafael, how effective has website blocking been, and that will it be? And then how important is it that, in addition to website blocking, there are additional enforcement mechanisms that are deployed by the regulator? I think particularly there are some observers who believe that preventing access to PIX, the instant payments framework controlled by the federal government, that's probably the key enforcement strategy that the government can deploy. So yeah, how effective is website blocking, and how important is it that we see additional tools put to work?
Well, James, website blocking in Brazil has been, let's say, somewhat effective, but it's far from a silver bullet.
Mm-hmm.
It's a useful tool to disrupt unlicensed operators, but it has its limitations, especially since players find ways to bypass those blocks through VPNs, or even the platforms can mirror sites. So this is something that the government and Anatel, that's the agency that controls the communications here in Brazil, is struggling a little bit. The Minister of Finance has shared a list with over 5,000 illegal websites, and they are trying to shut down all of them, but it's quite challenging. It seems like a more of a temporary fix than a long-term solution, in my opinion. And now, when it comes to financial transactions, that's where things get interesting. I strongly believe that targeting payments, particularly PIX, would be one of the most impactful enforcement strategies that the government should enforce. PIX is deeply integrated into the Brazil's digital economy, and unlicensed operators rely heavily on it because it's fast, easy, and widely trusted by players. Cutting off their access to PIX would make it significantly harder for them to operate in the market. That said, James, enforcement isn't just about blocking, in my opinion. It's also about making the regulated market more attractive. If licensed operators can offer better payment options, clearer rules, and a safer environment, it naturally pulls players away from the unlicensed sites. So yes, while blocking PIX for illegal operators could be a game changer, in my opinion, it's just one piece of a big puzzle that will require much more from the government and public health authorities in a general way.
Finally, Luis, switching gears really, because we've been talking here about fixed odds betting, sports betting, and iGaming in Brazil, which is regulated. It's been noted that Brazil really quite unusual in establishing its regulated market for online gambling without first having a pre-existing regulated market for land-based gaming. Very few countries have gone that way. There is legislation to authorize casino resorts and video bingo halls approved by the lower house of Congress and is pending in the Senate. But a scheduled vote on that bill in the Senate in early December was postponed. I guess the question I have for you is really, what are the prospects of Brazil doubling down on regulation of gambling in 2025 by following this launch of a regulated market for online gambling, through also approving a new law to regulate land-based casinos and bingo. What's your take on the prospects for land-based gaming expansion in 2025?
My perception is the launch of the regulated market for online gaming will calm down the voices against gaming. I think they're going to see the potential revenues. They are going to see some serious companies operating in Brazil. They will see a shift in the advertising quality. They will start to understand responsible gaming. And I think that may be the last piece of the puzzle missing for the approval of land-based casinos, actually land-based gaming in Brazil. So I'm very optimistic about having this approved this year.
I am afraid we have run out of time. We could have, I think, kept going for probably days, let alone hours, on exploring all the ins and outs of the new launched Brazilian market. And I appreciate that both of you have been exceptionally busy for the past few weeks, the run up to launch, and then this immediate aftermath. So on behalf of everyone at Vixio, Luis and Rafael, thank you again for your time. I think it's fair to say we'll have plenty to talk about if we schedule a fourth in this series of webinars on the Brazilian market in the coming months. It's something we'll look forward to doing. But thank you for your time. Thanks to all of you who have joined us today. I think we found an illuminating discussion, plenty to follow in this new era for Brazil in 2025. I'll pass you back to Jack, your webinar host, and he will just deliver some closing remarks.
Thank you, James, Luis, and Rafael, and thank you for attending today's session. As mentioned at the start of the broadcast, this webinar was recorded and a video was sent out to all attendees as soon as possible. If you asked a question during the broadcast that was not answered, a member of the Vixio team will look to get back to you with a reply in the coming days. I also wanted to let you know the next time you can meet the Vixio team. As you can see on your screen, Vixio will once again be exhibiting at ICE, this time at Barcelona. So if you wanted to discuss Brazil, technical compliance, or any other topics, be sure to drop by the Vixio stand 4D14 or arrange a meeting with our on-site expert team. Finally, if you have any questions about anything discussed in today's webinar or would like further information, please email info@vixio.com or visit our website vixio.com. Thank you.